This week's Technique Tuesday video is the third in a series of videos on converting written instructions for stitch patterns that were intended for flat knitting into instructions for knitting in the round. In the first video, I demonstrated the process of stitch pattern conversion for basic knit purl patterns. In the second video, I explained how to handle stitch patterns that call for a multiple of stitches plus some extra stitches. You can find links to those videos down in the description. In this video, I'll demonstrate how to convert wrong side row instructions that are a bit more complicated than simple knits and purls, and which include increases and decreases. When you are converting a pattern that was written for flat knitting to instructions for knitting in the round, one of the types of instructions that can be really confusing in terms of conversion is when wrong side rows have actions that are more complicated than just a simple knit or purl. For something like this, which is a simple pattern that's repeated for every single row, this can be the confusing part. What do you do about the yarn overs, and what do you do about the decreases? So the good news is with decreases is that just like the opposite of a knit is a purl and the opposite of a purl is a knit, the opposite of a knit two together is a purl two together, and the opposite of a purl two together is a knit two together. Likewise, the opposite of an SSK is an SSP, and the opposite of an SSP is an SSK. So that makes it pretty straightforward. You can extend that, so opposite of a knit three together is a purl three together, etc. Where you run into some difficulty potentially would be if you have a different type of double decrease, like slip one, knit two together, slip stitch over. Those are a little bit more complicated to convert. And so for that kind of a thing, I don't just ever know off the top of my head. I use Montse Stanley's Knitter's Handbook. It's excellent throughout, but it has a really good chapter on increases and decreases. It has every kind of increase. It has its mirror as well as the purl side version of it. So that's a kind of a reference manual that's really important if you're doing this kind of thing regularly, or even just once in a while where you wouldn't know just off the top of your head how to do that. So right away we know that the knit two together, the opposite's going to be a purl two together. So let's chart this out. The right side row will be easy to chart out, and then let's chart out the wrong side row so that we can see how that works. So the first stitch is a knit stitch, which is just a blank box, and then we will alternate yarn over and knit two together all the way across. And I like to chart out a few repeats of the stitch pattern so that can really see how it goes. And then again, we end with a knit one. So in the first video of this series, I showed how you can convert these written instructions into written instructions for knitting in the round, and then how you could convert them to charting. We can do that, but then I'll show you the shortcut that I actually take. So if we are going to convert this, we start at the end and where the period is, and we look at that instruction, and that would tell us purl one. Then we have this section with the asterisks that are indicating the repeat, and we work in the reverse direction. So we have to convert the knit two together into its opposite, which we've just discussed is a purl two together. And then we do a yarn over, and a yarn over is a yarn over. And then we're going to end by converting this knit one into a purl one. So in that first video in this series, I showed you how to change the written instructions. And so what you would do now is on all of the even rounds, you would work purl one, and then you'd repeat purl two together, yarn over all the way across until you got to the last stitch, and then you would do a purl one. So if you wanted to chart this, you would start over here because this is the direction that you would be working in the round. What I do to make the whole process faster is I convert and chart at the same time. So if I were actually working a wrong side row, I would be over at this edge of the fabric. And so I chart in the opposite direction, and I read it across in the order in which it was originally presented. So that's if you want to go directly from the written instructions to the chart. So opposite of a knit one is a purl one. Opposite of a yarn over is a yarn over. Opposite of a knit two together is a purl two together. The symbol for that is the same as a knit two together, but you put the little purl dot there. And then you repeat this all the way across. And you end, and you have to reverse that knit one to being a purl one. So we have several multiples drawn out here, but I think it's very useful to chart out several repeats so that we can actually see how this pattern works out more fully. If we were going to be knitting this in the round, but in a panel, so not all of the stitches of the round are going to be used in this pattern, just some of them, we would maintain these columns that are a single stitch of garter stitch. We would maintain that to frame the panel. But we might decide, well, we actually want to work this for the entire round. And so if you're going to do that, the first guess you would take would be, oh, well, I'm going to eliminate these two columns here. And so I would just work this mesh pattern completely in the round all the time. But the reason we want to chart out several repeats of the pattern is so that we can see what happens when we go from the end of the one round to the beginning of the next round. I've taken the garter stitch out, but I've created this column right here that I've shaded just to show you how the end of round one is going to end with this knit two together, and the beginning of round two is going to end with the purl two together, and that's fine. But when we get to the end of round two, you see we have this yarn over right here, so we're going to have two yarn overs next to each other. The end of round two and the beginning of round three are going to have two yarn overs. And what's going to happen is we won't see them as two separate yarn overs, small yarn overs. They're going to merge together like two little bubbles merge together to make a big bubble. We're going to see one big hole here instead of two small holes. So that's something to keep in mind when you are converting a pattern like this, is what happens at that transition from the end of the round to the beginning of the round. And if you have something like this, you might not want that. So what you might want to do instead is to keep one of these columns. And so you don't have an even number of stitches, you have an odd number of stitches. So you either start the round with this column of garter stitch, or you can end the round with a column of garter stitch. And you have this column that creates an obvious seam line, but it also separates the lace pattern so that you don't get those giant holes. So that's an option, but it's something to be aware of when you are converting these types of patterns. This video series focused on the basics of converting stitch patterns written for flat knitting into instructions for knitting in the round, whether the goal was to knit an all-over pattern or a pattern panel. If you have any questions about this video series or suggestions for other sorts of knitting conversions that you'd like to see, please let me know down in the comments below. It helps me make decisions about which techniques to demonstrate in the future. And if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you found it helpful, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.